Welcome! Italki is a very well-known place to learn languages online, and this video will be especially helpful if you're a beginner in your early days, you've taken a few lessons and you're still a bit scared, or you've taken a few lessons and you're not sure what to do, you're not sure if your plan is working, or if you haven't started yet and you've got a bit of nerves about doing so. So here's the plan for this video. I'm going to talk a little bit about fear because I think that's one of the biggest issues that people have on Italki. Then I'm going to talk about finding a good teacher because I think that I've learned some things that might be useful to help you get a teacher that you really gel with. And then I'll talk a little bit about how to work out a good plan. And then I'll also talk a bit about how to learn a language outside of the platform, which I think is really important. You can't just rely on Italki. So that's the plan. Right, I wanted to talk about fear because I think fear is probably one of the biggest struggles that people have when they're starting to learn learn a language on Italki. I know it was a big issue for me, and I've seen other people talk about it in other videos on, covering Italki and other language learning lessons. And I think that's kind of sad. I think part of the reason for that is just the way that people set it up. It is worth being realistic with yourself. Your very first lesson is going to be scary. I think there's not much that you could do about that. When you first call your first teacher before you've done anything, it is going to be scary. And one of the easiest ways to make that first lesson easier is just to book the shortest possible time that your teacher will allow. Don't force yourself to do something, a very long lesson before you're comfortable doing that. But the most important thing is setting up your lessons right, and I'll cover that in the section where I talk about how to set up good lessons. Apart from that, two important things. One is just mindset. It is a journey. You're not going to be a good Spanish speaker or French speaker or Russian speaker or whatever language you're learning until you've been in there and done it. So you don't need to be an expert on day one, and you don't need to be an expert for some time to come. So be free and feel like you can make mistakes. That's the whole point. So go in with that mindset that your teacher's expecting you to make mistakes, your teacher's expecting you to be a beginner, and that's part of the journey. The other big thing that I would suggest is get in a few reps early. One thing that I did that helped me tremendously was that I just booked a block of lessons. I had a few days where I booked a lesson every single day, so I got a whole bunch of lessons in quite quickly, and that helped me tremendously, because if you have big gaps between each lesson when you're just starting out, you come to each lesson as if it's your first again, and so that fear builds up. So if you do 5 days in a row where you do a lesson each day, even if it's just 15 minutes or 30 minutes, by the end of that, you've got some reps in, and you start to feel much more comfortable approaching it. I do think in the early days, one really important thing, which I still do to this day, is to book your next lesson right away. If you sort of feel pretty terrified as you finished your first lesson, put off booking the next one, and then a week or two goes by before you even book the lesson. You're not getting the reps in. So basically, as soon as you finished your current lesson, book the next one, or even before, so that it's just there. You just have it in your plan, and you're gonna do it. So those are the most important things that I can think of when it comes to fear. Okay, next thing, finding a teacher. It's really, really important to find a teacher you're gonna really connect with. Some people book with several teachers, and if that's your thing, that's fine. For me, it's worked really well to just have one main teacher. And I think it's important to be realistic about the fact that if you want to learn a language to the point where you're fluent in the language, you're going to be booking hundreds of lessons. I've done about 300 lessons in Spanish, and I'm still far from fluent. I've made massive progress, but I still know I'm going to do hundreds more lessons before I'm fluent in the language. So you want to have a teacher that you are really comfortable with, somebody you feel somewhat of a friendship with, somebody who you feel you can do hundreds of lessons with. With that in mind, my biggest recommendation for finding a good teacher is to book a lot of teachers in the beginning. In my early days, I didn't do that. I scrolled through, looked at profiles, and booked some teachers that I thought would work, and ended up having some teachers that I didn't know in those days, but teachers whose style just didn't work for me. I had teachers who were using online resources, which I found to be a bit like school, and kind of annoying, and also teachers who were pushing me to speak at a level that I was just really uncomfortable doing. It doesn't really matter. What I suggest, my biggest suggestion, is book 5 teachers that you think seem good, and then take 2 lessons with each, and book a few more if you're still not sure with each of those teachers. That might end up with 20 odd lessons before you've settled on the teacher that you really want to work with. 20 lessons in the long run is very little compared to the hundreds that you're probably going to do if you're serious about getting fluent in the language. Okay, so the next section is all about how to make a plan that works for you. The first thing is just think carefully about pace. You are going to be in this for the long run, as I said, and you need to be realistic about a plan that's going to work for you. And so early on, you don't want to have any sense of urgency. You need to know that language learning is a journey. Language learning is something that takes a significant investment of your time. You might see people online who seem to learn languages very rapidly. Unless you've got an incredible mind, there's certainly some people who seem to learn faster than others, or you've got incredible amounts of time. That's unlikely to be the case. If you're watching this video, I suspect that language learning is going to take you some time. So be realistic about that. Let yourself ease into it. Go at a pace that suits you, and know that you don't need to see progress. You don't need to feel like you're progressing constantly. Just stick with it. Stay with it for the long haul, and you will learn the language. That said, I do think there's some value to having a bit of urgency to a small extent. Push yourself a little bit. Do go beyond your comfort zone. Do learn the things where you're getting stuck. I tend to find from time to time I'm just not getting some grammar rule that I've been working on for weeks and weeks, and so then I sit down and I figure it out, and it helps me move on. I still get stuck on things like that pretty often, but I think there's some value to sometimes sitting down and going, okay, this thing has been holding me up. Let me put some deliberate effort into this and get it done. And give yourself a bit of a push. But in general, you're going to be in this for the long haul. Be ready for that. So that's very important. Another thing that I would advise is be very careful of advice. Now, I'm giving you advice here, but what I mean is don't just follow a strategy that somebody gives online. There are all these techniques, comprehensible input, or each online polyglot has got their own system that you can follow that's guaranteed to make you fluent in whatever. Don't worry about that. what you want to do is figure out a plan that works for you, that not only will help you learn the language, but also that fits your time, that fits your personality. And then experiment. There's nothing wrong with watching online polyglots, especially the people that are genuinely knowledgeable about how language acquisition works, about how people learn languages. Watch them, but don't necessarily just blindly follow their system. Try things for yourself, figure out what works, adapt, speak to your teacher. Think of it not as something that you're going to figure out today. Think of it not as something that you're going to figure out in one go and then you've got it. Think of it rather as something that you're going to be figuring out as you go along constantly. Sometimes it's fine not to even be working on anything specifically. Sometimes you can just be chatting and coasting along. Sometimes you need to push a little bit on certain things. Try different techniques, try things that you see online and give them a good go. But don't feel like you got to radically change what you do because you saw somebody online who says that this system doesn't work and that system does work. There really isn't that much research behind language acquisition, and even the experts aren't necessarily that knowledgeable, especially when it comes to you. You need the system that works for you, and the best thing to do is to figure that out for yourself, especially with your Italki teacher. Another reason to watch online content surrounding other language learners is inspiration. So don't necessarily follow everything that they say, but it's quite fun to see people who are just a few steps ahead of you. I do that constantly, and get inspired by their progress, because if they can do it and they're a few steps ahead of you, you can do it. So I would far rather watch somebody who's making progress in the language rather than some expert who's got some advice and selling some plan. I hope that you're finding this stuff useful. It's been really, really useful for me as I've gone along. I'm so grateful that I've been able to learn the language. And if you do find any of these tips useful, please leave my video a like. I'd really appreciate that. As far as your teacher goes, I would recommend just sticking with one primary teacher. I know that other people do different things and have multiple teachers, but for me it's been really nice. I think the friendship is important, mainly because, as I said before, you want to do this in the long term. So it matters that you're spending your time with somebody that you enjoy spending time with. And so it's worked very well for me to have one teacher. I've learned a tremendous amount from my teacher just about how to do this better. But at the same time, I've also been able to ask for what I want. As you build the friendship, you can say, this is where my gaps are, this is what I'm feeling uncomfortable about. And so you can adjust your plan with your teacher on an ongoing basis because you build up that relationship. Now, that's not to say that you should only ever use one teacher. I do sometimes use other teachers, and I mainly do that when my own teacher isn't available for some reason. And what I've done recently is I go and I book a lesson with the newest teacher on the platform that I can find. And I just like doing that to give somebody new an opportunity. And that gives me a chance to have a purely conversational lesson. Generally, I don't ask for any training in those lessons. I just do it as a purely conversational lesson. That's obviously not something you're going to do from the get-go, but once you are ready for conversation lessons, they can be really enjoyable, and it gives you exposure to different people. All right, let's talk about a plan itself. When you early on, you don't want pressure to the point where this becomes an uncomfortable thing. One of the biggest ways to make something last long and to stay the course, to learn the language, is to make this a fun thing to do. And one big way to do that is not to put yourself under pressure that you're just not up to in the beginning. So one of the biggest things that I did that really was a big help to me to ease into the process was to start out with just purely pronunciation lessons. So my teacher would provide me with some texts that I would read, and we would go over them several times until my pronunciation was okay. I'd learn the words, I'd learn to understand the text, so there's still some learning going on, but I didn't need to produce the language at that early stage, and it was a really helpful way to get into it. So that's a nice, easy way to get started. Another easy way is to go over content that you're covering in comprehensible input. So if you're listening to videos outside of your Italki class, you can ask your teacher to go over some portion of the video. Often I did this for just small pieces of a video to help me understand content that I was struggling to get to grips with, that I was struggling to understand. And I found that really useful. So both of those are quite easy, stress-free ways to get classes in and get exposure to the language, find your way into doing these Italki classes. Another thing that I found extremely helpful that my teacher did for me was to provide small phrases for things that I use often. So good examples are greetings, goodbye, and as you start. Another thing was asking how to say something. ¿Cómo se dice esto? How do I say this? Phrases like that, phrases that you keep using again and again, and to have little small conversations that you do often. For example, with my teacher, I often talk about the weather. I still struggle to get the grammar right and the words right, but it's quite helpful to build up these little normal conversations that you have often. And so you've got these little phrases that fit in and start allowing you to use the language in a very easy, comfortable way. It really does work. It might seem like you need to get to the language really quickly, and I know there are people who would fundamentally disagree with my approach to this, but I have found it extremely useful. And at this point, at 300 lessons, I'm far from proficient. My grammar is still pretty terrible, but I can have a conversation. I can have an hour-long conversation in Spanish. I might need to ask for grammar corrections and don't get it all correct, and I don't know all the words all the time, but I can ask for the words that I need to ask in Spanish. I can ask for the grammar corrections that I need in Spanish, so I can have an entire conversation in Spanish already. So it might not be everybody's approach, but for me, taking this much gentler approach to getting into your Italki lessons helps so much, because sticking with them, putting in the reps, getting more and more lessons done produces the results that you're after. Outside of Italki, it's good to have a system to learn the language on your own. Your teacher is not going to provide you with everything you need to learn the language. I think the best method to do this is to use comprehensible input. For Spanish, I've been using a system called Dreaming Spanish. And if you're interested in knowing a bit more about Dreaming Spanish, you probably want to